This presentation unfolds on three parallel layers: a spoken narrative outlining the broader research process, a textual layer providing direct explanations of the images displayed, and a visual archive presenting frames and fabrication stages. For accessibility and professional clarity, the narration was generated using artificial intelligence. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Atar Brosh. I am a senior lecturer, industrial designer, and practice-based design researcher. My work connects material experimentation, structural thinking, and pedagogy within contemporary design. This talk was not conceived as a manual for building bicycles. It grew out of sustained engagement with designing, building, repairing, and riding. Knowledge accumulated through long-term practice, not instruction. Here, design is not treated as a sequence of outcomes. It is treated as a process that unfolds over time through repeated decisions, constraints, use, and revision, and through its gradual entanglement with everyday life. If you're interested in bicycle construction, you will encounter structure, materials, and fabrication. But the scope extends beyond the technical object, toward how artifacts are conceived, produced, maintained, and sustained over time. Throughout this work, the bicycle functions as a material case through which broader questions are examined: technology, labor, infrastructure, and the relationship between intention and consequence. The research began in 2012. Since then, 22 frames have been built, ranging from flax fiber and bamboo composites to aluminum constructions assembled through handheld laser welding. Building a bicycle frame is a multidisciplinary experience. It requires cultural awareness, structural reasoning, and technical skill across both design and engineering. Once the efficiency of the human-machine relationship was understood, bicycles became carriers of values that exceed pure function. The frame becomes a design object, where material choice, joining methods, fabrication, terrain, and use converge. These decisions are always shaped by constraints and negotiated compromises. Those conditions are not noise around the research. They provide the ground on which the research operates. This frame story project did not begin with frame construction. It began with repair, practical curiosity rather than performance goals, trying to understand how existing systems actually function. Over time, upgrading, downgrading, and reusing components reached saturation. Modification stopped being informative. That pushed the work toward construction and structural understanding, frame building as a necessary step, not a predefined objective. This process unfolded largely outside institutional frameworks. Educational programs existed, but in practice they were often inaccessible due to cost, location, timing, or structural incompatibility with everyday conditions. In response, an improvised path took shape: self-directed learning, gradual tool acquisition, trial and error, and long-term experimentation unfolding without formal validation. Only in retrospect did this accumulation begin to resemble a coherent research trajectory. At the time, it was simply continuity. Independent research in this context is characterized less by autonomy than by responsibility. Decisions are sustained through use rather than approval. Progress is measured through continuity rather than recognition. Without institutional deadlines, ideas are allowed to develop at their own pace. Failure remains contained. Revisions remain open-ended. Questions are able to return in altered form after periods of distance. This absence of external validation does not reduce rigor. It relocates it inward toward coherence over time. At the same time, this work is inseparable from broader structural shifts, the expansion of maker culture and access to digital fabrication tools. Making has migrated from centralized industrial environments into domestic and semi-private spaces. Documentation and sharing have replaced guarded expertise, reshaping how professional knowledge is produced and distributed. These changes have not simply expanded access to design, they have altered its internal logic. The designer's traditional role as intermediary between material, form, and technology has been reconfigured. Design practice has extended into hybrid and process-driven territories, operating within distributed systems of production. This presentation operates within that condition, addressing its implications through practice rather than assertion. Two intertwined processes define the work: frame story as long-term material research and its translation into a pedagogical framework. Technical considerations of durability and efficiency coexist with questions of structure and use, positioning the bicycle as a cultural object shaped by engineering decisions and material constraints. What originated as independent practice gradually entered the classroom as an academic design studio in which students design and build bicycles from the ground up. Rather than transmitting fixed conclusions, the course exposes students to a method grounded in constraints, material behavior, and construction principles. Teaching does not conclude the research, it extends it, introducing new perspectives, new constraints, and new forms of negotiation. Together, making, riding, teaching, maintaining, and reflecting operate as interconnected activities. Research remains embedded in daily practice rather than separated from it, shaped by time, repetition, and lived experience. The chapters move between objects and systems, tools and decisions, manual labor and reflective observation. Individual frames function as experimental platforms, while constraints generate methods and long-term engagement reshapes both outcomes and questions. The bicycle operates throughout as both subject and instrument, a machine built for use, and a structure through which thinking takes place. The translation of research insights into an academic studio framework, its structure, exercises, assessment logic, and technical workflows is addressed separately. That operational layer focuses on how research becomes syllabus and teaching methodology, rather than on the research process itself. 18 years ago, I sold my car and shifted entirely to bicycles. The decision was not framed as an environmental statement or lifestyle commitment. It emerged from practical considerations and gradually solidified into a structural condition. Daily commuting transformed into a laboratory. The bicycle became both transportation device and research instrument. Distance, terrain, weather, mechanical failure, and fatigue produced data that no simulation could fully anticipate. Every adjustment in geometry reappeared as sensation. Every material decision reappeared as vibration. Design choices made in the workshop became measurable in the body. Over time, riding ceased to be separate from research. It became its validation process. The frame was no longer an isolated object. It became part of a lived infrastructure. Durability was tested through repetition rather than specification sheets. Fatigue, micro-fractures, misalignment, and component wear were not abstract risks. They were direct consequences. Repair became part of the design cycle, not its failure. Each frame did not replace the previous one. It extended the conversation. Some frames investigated material behavior, others focused on structural configuration or fabrication access. Early experiments explored bamboo and flax fiber composites. These materials introduced flexibility, low cost, and regenerative potential, creating a structural framework that supported experimentation and adjustment. They also introduced unpredictability. Hand-built joints revealed tolerance limits that industrial production normally conceals. Improvised jigs forced precision through constraint rather than machinery. Material choice was never purely aesthetic. It emerged from availability, cost, and structural behavior. Gradually, digital modeling entered the process. Parametric tools allowed geometric adjustments to be tested before material commitment. Digital modeling did not replace manual fabrication, it reorganized it. Parametric design introduced variability as a controlled parameter, rather than as an accident. Geometry could now shift according to rider dimensions, terrain requirements, or structural priorities. Instead of redrawing from scratch, relationships were adjusted within a system. This shifted the logic of iteration. Testing moved partly into simulation. Yet simulation remained incomplete. Material behavior under dynamic riding conditions still exceeded predictive modeling. The digital did not eliminate uncertainty, it redistributed it. Additive manufacturing entered selectively, primarily in joints and connectors. 3D printed elements allowed complex intersections that were previously inaccessible. These components did not exist as decorative gestures, they solved structural problems. Long-term research is sustained less by intention than by structure. Unlike projects defined by funding cycles or deliverables, extended inquiry develops under uncertainty, delayed feedback, and shifting relevance. Its central challenge is not how to begin, but how to continue. Questions resist closure. They reappear attached to new tools, materials, and contexts. Progress becomes difficult to assess while it is happening. Outcomes remain ambiguous for long periods, visible only in retrospect. Under these conditions, motivation proves insufficient. What allows the work to persist is a durable relationship to a limited set of unresolved questions. These questions remain active even when no direct work is being done. They operate in the background, shaping attention across unrelated activities. In Frame Story Project, persistence did not emerge from a declared agenda. It developed through repetition, through structural tensions that refused resolution. Returning to these tensions became less a deliberate choice and more an established mode of engagement. Long-term research advances unevenly. Periods of inactivity are not interruptions but part of its rhythm. Chronology exists, yet progress remains non-linear. Earlier frames are not sketches, later frames are not definitive answers. In some way, what matters is not success itself of building a unique, personalized frame, but what becomes visible through thinking, making, and riding. For much of their history, bicycles were treated as inherently sustainable machines. Their efficiency and human-powered propulsion positioned them as ecological counterpoints to motorized transport. In comparison to automobiles, bicycles were widely perceived as materially modest and environmentally harmless. Yet sustainability is not a property of an object, it is a property of a system. Over the past 2 decades, bicycles have been absorbed into industrial and financial frameworks governed by scale and speed. Within these systems, durability became secondary to deployment velocity. Life cycle considerations yielded to expansion metrics. Urban bicycle sharing schemes illustrate this shift clearly. Marketed as sustainable mobility solutions, many prioritized rapid scaling over structural integration. Bicycles were produced in large quantities and distributed aggressively. Maintenance infrastructures often lagged behind expansion. When business models failed or regulations shifted, fleets were abandoned. Images of bicycle graveyards became visible indicators of systemic imbalance: blocked sidewalks, bicycles abandoned in public space, and infrastructures unable to sustain hardware at scale. When ownership disappeared, accountability followed. In the absence of personal or institutional responsibility tied to each object, maintenance became secondary, lifespan shortened, and replacement replaced repair as the dominant logic. The contradiction was not technological. A bicycle used briefly and discarded does not embody sustainability. Responsibility diffused across operators, municipalities, manufacturers, and users. Sustainability in this context became narrative rather than practice. The material footprint of a bicycle is distributed across its years of use. When those years are compressed, embedded costs dominate its overall impact. Alongside these systemic shifts, another transformation has been unfolding, largely outside formal design discourse. Production has migrated from centralized factories and institutional studios into domestic and semi-domestic spaces. Garages, balconies, spare rooms, shared workshops. These environments now host processes once restricted to industry. The shift is infrastructural. Desktop 3D printers, compact CNC machines, laser cutters, and handheld welding systems have altered who can fabricate. These tools do not only simulate, they make real parts. Their accessibility changes not only participation, but continuity. Institutional environments operate through procurement cycles, approvals, scheduling constraints, and spatial limitations. For long-term practice-based research, such interruptions shape what can realistically be pursued. Continuity depends on having the right infrastructure, not just good intentions. A privately maintained workspace becomes necessary, not as a romantic studio, but as an operational condition. In such a space, decisions move directly from thought to material execution. Failures are absorbed locally, revisions occur without formal delay. The boundary between living and making dissolves. Production becomes embedded within daily routines. This embedding alters the tempo of design. Work unfolds incrementally rather than episodically. Questions persist beyond project timelines. Tools accumulate gradually, guided by use rather than planning. Infrastructure evolves through necessity rather than strategy. This condition does not guarantee efficiency, it enables duration. And duration, in turn, reshapes the logic of experimentation. When access to tools is continuous, iteration becomes structural rather than exceptional. The frame story research presented here is unfolded within such a condition. The emergence of domestic production spaces did not occur in isolation, but alongside broader shifts in how making and authority are distributed. Maker culture did not originate within design institutions, nor did it seek their validation. It emerged through access to tools, documentation, components, and shared experimentation. Processes once transmitted through apprenticeship or guarded within professional environments became publicly visible. Tutorials, build logs, and documentation transformed hidden knowledge into searchable material. Making became legible, transforming informal and experience-based knowledge into documented, transferable procedures. When processes become observable and repeatable, authority no longer rests on exclusivity, but on the ability to interpret, select, and integrate. Design can no longer rely on opacity to sustain distinction. Procedural knowledge alone is insufficient. What remains is judgment, the ability to select constraints. To navigate uncertainty, define what is meaningful, and remain responsible as consequences emerge. In this environment, individuals who do not identify as designers perform design continuously. They select materials, adapt systems, negotiate tolerances, and iterate solutions. Design institutions have widely adopted the tools of maker culture, labs, fabrication spaces, and digital manufacturing facilities. Yet the structural shift is deeper. Making no longer depends on institutional proximity. It depends on access, responsibility, and persistence. Authority does not vanish. It moves from gatekeeping production to structuring meaning. This relocation of authority changes how design practice is evaluated. Exclusivity no longer defines expertise. Continuity, judgment, and long-term responsibility become central. In such a condition, distinction is not achieved only through access to tools. It emerges through the ability to sustain inquiry over time. This shift alters how objects are understood. They are no longer viewed primarily as finished products. They are seen as positions within an ongoing process. Against this background, the individual frame returns, not as a commodity, but as a material argument. Each frame becomes a temporary stabilization of a question, stable enough to be built and ridden, open enough to remain unresolved. The frames presented in this project are not products awaiting refinement, nor steps toward a final optimized model. Each frame functions as an experiment, constructed to investigate a limited and clearly defined question. An experiment in this context is not judged primarily by performance metrics. It is judged by what becomes visible through its construction and use. Some frames performed reliably, yet clarified little. Others exposed structural weaknesses while generating durable insight. Failure, therefore, is not interruption. It is a diagnostic condition. Each frame isolates a restricted set of variables. Material choice, joint logic, fabrication method, alignment strategy, or logistical constraint. Rarely are more than 2 or 3 parameters allowed to shift simultaneously. This limitation is methodological. Without constraint, cause and effect dissolve into coincidence. Chronology exists within the project, but progress is not linear. Earlier frames are not preparatory sketches. Later frames are not definitive conclusions. Certain structural questions recur across years under different technological and material conditions. Alignment, tolerance, stiffness, repairability, each reappears from new angles. No single jig, workflow, or fabrication technology defines the project. Tools are introduced only when demanded by a specific structural problem. When a tool disappears, it is because its relevance ended. Materials are not treated as neutral carriers of form. Steel, aluminum, bamboo, flax fiber composites, each reorganizes structural possibilities. The frame aesthetics, therefore, is a record of negotiated constraints made visible. The redistribution of production into domestic spaces coincided with another structural shift: direct access to global supply chains. Platforms such as AliExpress did not simply expand purchasing options. They reconfigured the relationship between designer and manufacturer. Sourcing became inseparable from design. Geometry, tolerances, material selection, and assembly logic were influenced not only by function, but by availability. Lead time, minimum quantities, shipping cost, and compatibility entered the design equation. Design no longer began from an abstract ideal. It began from what could be obtained. Components arrived with inconsistent tolerances and incomplete documentation. Rather than eliminating uncertainty, the process absorbed it. Structures had to accommodate variation. Assemblies had to tolerate deviation. The designer operated less as a form giver and more as a systems integrator. AliExpress, in this sense, functioned not as a store, but as an exposure to the architecture of contemporary production. 18 years ago, I sold my car. The decision was not framed as an environmental declaration. It was not a lifestyle manifesto. It emerged from practical considerations. Over time, that practical decision became a structural condition. Riding replaced driving, not only as transportation. It reorganized daily routines. It reshaped work patterns. It altered how time was measured. Constraints became immediate. Distance, weather, fatigue, and terrain were no longer abstract. They structured daily planning. Living without a car did not simplify the research. It intensified it. Commuting became testing. Maintenance became analysis. Repair became structural inquiry. Evaluation no longer occurred at completion. It unfolded across weeks, months, and years. Wear revealed stress concentrations. Noise exposed tolerance drift. Component degradation recorded long-term performance. Under these conditions, the bicycle ceased to be an object of study. It became infrastructure. Daily dependence created a continuous feedback loop. Over time, the research did not remain private. It entered the classroom. Not as a finished doctrine, but as a working method. The studio did not replicate the frames. It replicated the structure of inquiry. Students are not asked to imitate outcomes. They are asked to work within constraints. Material behavior became central. Geometry is not an aesthetic preference. It is a conceptual negotiation. Fabrication is not delegated. It is integral to design thinking. Alignment, tolerance, and fit are not abstract concepts. They are experienced directly. Failure is not penalized. It is analyzed. The academic studio, therefore, extends the research. New questions emerge from new bodies and new constraints. The classroom becomes another experimental environment. The work continues not as expansion for its own sake, but as a sustained return to recurring structural questions. Rather than seeking constant growth, the project revisits the same tensions under new material and technological conditions. Each return is not repetition in the narrow sense, but a re-engagement shaped by time and accumulated experience. Structural questions reappear across frames, asking to be reconsidered rather than resolved. Material and technological negotiation remains central, as every new configuration redefines the limits of possibility. Use continues to function as the ultimate testing ground, extending design beyond fabrication. The archive grows slowly, not through reinvention, but through disciplined repetition. Over time, patterns emerge, not by declaration, but through accumulation. Some questions persist across years, returning under altered constraints. Others fade, revealing themselves to have been temporary rather than structural. The bicycle remains a modest machine precisely because its scale keeps consequences tangible. Its material simplicity prevents abstraction from drifting too far from lived reality. Within this scale, decisions remain exposed rather than concealed. Each frame, therefore, remains provisional, open to revision through continued use. Each decision carries responsibility beyond the moment of construction. The project does not seek a final resolution or a definitive model. Its aim is continuity, the sustained engagement with material, means of production, cultural attributes, and constraint. Continuity becomes not merely duration, but method. Constraint functions not as limitation, but as framework. Duration becomes the measure through which decisions are evaluated. Looking back across the archive, what becomes visible is not a style, but a change in scale. Working at the scale of a single bicycle frame forces decisions to remain exposed rather than absorbed by large systems. Small objects do not hide structural mistakes for long. They reveal them in use, sometimes quietly, sometimes persistently. This scale has shaped the research more than any declared methodology. Another lesson concerns pace. Design culture often rewards acceleration and visible output. This project evolved at a slower rhythm. Not by resisting technology, but by allowing integration to take time. Adoption was gradual, not reactive. Tools entered the process when they became structurally relevant, not when they became fashionable. This pacing required restraint as much as curiosity. When one designs, fabricates, assembles, rides, and repairs the same object, distance collapses. There is no external department to absorb consequences. The feedback loop remains personal. Decisions return physically. Under these conditions, design is less about authorship and more about stewardship. The object is not released into the world and forgotten. It remains present. This persistence has shaped the trajectory of the work more than any single technological breakthrough. The research therefore advances through lived iteration rather than conceptual resets. Its coherence emerges from staying with a problem long enough to see it change form. Thank you for accompanying this extended journey through the archive. I recognize the commitment required to stay with a presentation of this length. I hope the process shared here has offered insight into how making, teaching, and research can remain intertwined. If some of these questions resonate within your own context, then the exchange has already begun. I look forward to future conversations, whether in person or across formats. And I hope we will meet again at the next conference.